I sat in the familiar, high-backed wooden chair of our family kitchen in Raleigh, North Carolina, staring straight across the weathered oak table at my father, David, while I finally forced myself to say the exact words that I had been keeping locked away behind a wall of silence and resentment for several years. I made sure my voice was steady and devoid of the tremors that usually came with such heavy emotions, and I told him firmly, "If I am forced to listen to even one more single, unsolicited sentence from your wife, Sandra, concerning my personal finances, or the money I have worked so hard to earn in the military, I am telling you right now that there are not going to be any polite or civil conversations left between us anymore." I let the threat hang in the air, emphasizing that I would be the one to personally explain to her exactly where she stood in this hierarchy, and why my hard-earned money was absolutely not her property to claim or manage. The room went instantly silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that feels like it has a physical weight to it, while the only sound was the low, consistent hum of the old refrigerator vibrating in the corner. My stepmother's decorative coffee cup, adorned with a floral pattern that Sarah, my birth mother, would have never liked, froze halfway to her lips as she processed the bluntness of my declaration. My father looked at me with a mixture of shock and profound sadness, his eyes searching my face as if he truly didn't recognize his own daughter anymore, or perhaps he was just mourning the submissive girl I used to be. That was the singular, defining moment when everything in our family dynamic fundamentally changed, shifting the foundation of a house that had been built on half-truths and tiptoeing around Sandra's ego. I grew up with the idealistic belief that families only broke apart in loud, explosive ways, characterized by theatrical shouting matches, slammed doors that echoed through the hallways, and the kind of screaming arguments that made the neighbors in our quiet Raleigh cul-de-sac whisper behind their curtains. I didn't have the life experience, yet to know that families could also break apart quietly, eroding one forced, polite smile at a time until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. It was a slow disintegration, fueled by one subtle, passive-aggressive comment slid under the table like a sharpened knife during a Sunday dinner. My biological mother, Sarah, passed away when I was only 15 years old, leaving a void in our lives that felt impossible to navigate. The cause was cancer, a fast-moving, aggressive, and entirely unforgiving disease that robbed her of her vitality before I even had a chance to say a proper goodbye. One beautiful North Carolina summer, she was just complaining about a dull, persistent ache in her side that she thought was a pulled muscle from gardening. By the time winter rolled around and the trees were skeletal, and I was standing at her graveside in a pair of borrowed black shoes that pinched my heels with every step, while well-meaning strangers told me over and over again how remarkably strong I was. I grew to absolutely hate that word, strong, because in my mind, being strong simply meant that you weren't allowed to fall apart or show the world that you were bleeding inside. My father, David, struggled with the silence of the house more than I did, and he waited just under a year before he began the process of introducing us to Sandra. She wasn't an obviously cruel woman, and she didn't fit the archetype of the wicked stepmother from a fairy tale, which was exactly what made her so difficult to handle. That was the primary problem. She smiled entirely too much with a cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke with a soft, melodic tone that felt manufactured, and she would frequently touch my arm when she talked to me as if we were already incredibly close. She quickly established herself in our community, bringing overcomplicated casseroles to the neighbors and expensive bottles of wine to every dinner party she was invited to. Before long, everyone in our social circle seemed to like her, and they all made a point to tell me how incredibly lucky my father was to have found some semblance of happiness again after such a tragic loss. I was 17 by that point, which was old enough to see through the thin veneer of her performance, but I was still young enough and tired enough from grieving to just stay quiet and let things happen. When I finally left Raleigh to head off to basic training at Fort Jackson 2 years later, my father hugged me so hard that I could feel the thumping of his heart, and he whispered through tears that he was immensely proud of the woman I was becoming. Sandra was there, of course, and she managed to cry just the right amount to look supportive and maternal without actually risking a smudge of her perfectly applied mascara. "We will take care of absolutely everything back here at home while you're away," she told me with that practiced warmth. "So you just focus all your energy on your training and your future in the army." At the time, I chose to believe her, or perhaps I just desperately needed to believe that my home would remain a safe harbor while I went out into the world. The military was a transformative experience for me, teaching me the essential values of discipline, extreme patience, and an ironclad sense of emotional control. It taught me the tactical advantage of listening far more than I spoke, how to accurately read the hidden tensions in a room, and most importantly, the strategic value of knowing how to wait for the right moment to act. Those lessons ended up being the very things that saved my sanity later on, even if I didn't realize the gravity of the situation during those early months of service. The very first comment regarding my military pay and savings came during my second year of active duty service, during a time when I was starting to build a decent financial cushion for myself. We were caught up in a routine video call on a Sunday afternoon, and I could see that Sandra was sitting closely beside my father on the living room couch, her hand resting lightly on his knee, as if she needed to constantly remind the world, and me, exactly where she belonged in his life. "You must be doing exceptionally well for yourself now," she remarked with a thin smile, her eyes searching for a reaction. "With your steady army pay, your tax-free housing allowance, and all those specialized enlistment bonuses you mentioned, you must have quite a bit saved up." I simply shrugged my shoulders, keeping my expression neutral and professional, the way I had been trained to do under pressure. "I manage my money well enough, and I make sure I'm living within my means," I told her, offering as little detail as possible. "Well," she continued, her voice taking on a suggestive, oily quality, "it is certainly good to know that the family as a whole has that kind of financial security to lean on if things get tight." I felt a cold shiver of intuition run through me because I deeply disliked the specific, inclusive way she emphasized the word family, as if my individual salary was suddenly a communal pot she had access to. From that day forward, the comments about my finances became a recurring theme in our communications, though they were always carefully framed as motherly concern and delivered with a polite, soft-spoken tone. She would ask me questions like, "Have you started thinking about your long-term estate planning yet?" Or suggest, "Wouldn't it be so much easier on you if your father helped you manage your accounts since you're so young and often stationed in remote locations?" She would often sigh and remark about how money could be so overwhelming for a young woman to handle on her own, implying that I was somehow incapable of managing my own life. Each time these suggestions were made, my father would just nod his head quietly in agreement, staring at the floor or the wall to avoid meeting my questioning eyes. When I would finally come home to Raleigh on leave, I began to notice subtle but disturbing changes to the physical landscape of my childhood home. My mother's antique roll-top desk, which had been her favorite place to write letters and pay bills, was suddenly gone, replaced by a sleek, sterile glass table that Sandra claimed made the entire room feel cleaner and more modern. Even the old, weathered wooden filing cabinet, where my mom had kept everything from important insurance papers to every single birthday card I had ever sent her, had vanished without a trace. When I finally worked up the courage to ask where my mother's things had gone, Sandra just waved a dismissive hand in the air and gave me a condescending smile. "Oh, we just decided to get rid of those old, dusty things while we were organizing the house," she said airily. "So you really don't need to worry yourself about that old stuff anymore, honey." I started worrying almost immediately, a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach that told me my history was being systematically erased to make room for her new order. One evening after we had finished a quiet dinner, Sandra brought out a tray of dessert and casually dropped a bombshell into the conversation. "I've been thinking that we should really talk about consolidating all of our various bank accounts into one family trust," she mentioned, her tone so casual you would think she was talking about the weather. It just makes the most sense for families to operate as a single financial unit, don't you think? I didn't even pick up my dessert spoon. Instead, I set my fork down with a definitive clink against the china and looked her right in the face. My bank accounts are perfectly fine exactly where they are, and I have no interest in changing how they are managed, I stated firmly, leaving no room for negotiation. She just smiled back at me, seemingly unbothered by my bluntness, and took a dainty sip of her tea. Of course, dear, it was just a passing thought I had for the sake of efficiency, she replied, though I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. That night, I lay wide awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the faint, rectangular outline on the wallpaper where my mother's floral calendar used to hang before it was discarded. I felt like an unwanted guest in a house that used to be mine, a stranger in a place where I was once the most important person in the world. The actual breaking point of my patience didn't come with a dramatic, movie-style shouting match. It arrived in the form of cold, digital paperwork. A standard bank notification popped up in my email inbox while I was on duty at the base, alerting me to a potential security issue with my account. It was a routine security alert regarding an attempted access to my online banking portal and a failed attempt at an incorrect verification process. I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins as I stared at the screen, knowing with absolute certainty that no one in the world had my login information or my passwords except for me. When I immediately called the bank's fraud department to figure out what was happening, the representative asked me if I had recently authorized a family member to help manage my finances, or if I had shared my social security number for account verification. I told them with an unwavering voice that I had absolutely not authorized anyone, and then my heart nearly stopped when they mentioned that the inquiry was originating from an IP address connected to my father's residential address in Raleigh. That was the exact moment when something soft and forgiving inside of me finally hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I didn't call them to scream, and I didn't send a fiery text message. Instead, I waited 2 weeks until I was scheduled for leave and went home to face them in person. When I arrived back in Raleigh, I didn't start the trip by accusing them of anything, and I never once raised my voice in the initial days. I just sat back and watched them, observing their behavior with the detached, analytical eye of a scout in enemy territory. Sandra was talking even more than usual, her conversation peppered with complaints about the rising cost of utilities, the volatility of her investments, and how incredibly expensive it was to maintain a house of this size. She spoke at length about how my father, David, deserved to finally relax and enjoy a comfortable retirement after everything he had been through with the loss of Sarah and the stress of his job. Finally, during a particularly quiet afternoon in the living room, she finally felt bold enough to say the words out loud. "Well, your military salary and that generous housing allowance are really part of the collective resources of this household anyway, so it's only right we use them for the common good." I didn't look at her. Instead, I turned my gaze toward my father, waiting for him to step in, to defend my autonomy, or to at least acknowledge that what she was saying was wrong. He didn't correct her, and he didn't even look up from the newspaper he was pretending to read, choosing to hide in the safety of his silence. That was when I slowly stood up, walked over to the kitchen table where they were sitting, and said the words that had been building like a pressure cooker in my chest for the last few years. I spoke calmly and clearly, without a hint of the anger that was vibrating through my nervous system. "If I hear one more single sentence from your wife about my money, Dad," I said, locking eyes with him and refusing to let him look away this time, "there will be no more polite conversations between us." I told them both that I would explain to her exactly where she stood and why my money was not, and would never be, hers to touch or even discuss. "Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" I asked, my voice as cold as a winter morning in the mountains. Sandra's permanent, artificial smile finally disappeared, and my father's face drained of all its color as he realized I was no longer the little girl he could manage with a pat on the head. He gave a barely perceptible nod of his head, but I already knew deep down that a simple understanding wasn't the same thing as actual respect. And respect was something that I was officially done asking for in this house. I didn't realistically expect anything to change overnight just because I had finally issued a stern warning. I knew enough about people like Sandra to know that they didn't just retreat or give up because they were finally confronted with the truth. Instead, they simply adjusted their tactics, smiling a little and retreating to the shadows to wait for a better angle or a moment when my guard was down. For the next few weeks after that confrontation, things in the Raleigh house were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt artificial and strained. Sandra stopped mentioning my bank accounts or my army bonuses directly, but she didn't stop the pressure campaign entirely. Instead, she leaned heavily into a new strategy of long, meandering stories about her own personal stress, the weight of her responsibilities, and how difficult it was to hold the entire household together while I was away on duty. She never asked for a specific dollar amount or an outright transfer of funds anymore, mostly because she didn't have to. She was a master of the implication, letting the silent pressure of her needs hang in the air of the house like the thick, oppressive humidity before a massive North Carolina summer storm. In the meantime, my father seemed to be growing smaller and more insignificant with every passing day. I noticed the decline in the way he would immediately defer to her in every conversation, and how he would instinctively glance at her for permission before he answered even the simplest of questions. I would frequently catch him mid-sentence, abruptly changing the course of what he was saying just because she had shifted her weight in her seat or cleared her throat in a specific way. It was a subtle, almost invisible form of control, but once I had seen the strings being pulled, I found it impossible to unsee them. My time in the military had taught me a very important lesson about the nature of power. Control doesn't always come from the use of blunt force. More often than not, the most effective form of control comes from slow, steady conditioning until the subject doesn't even realize they've lost their will. The next time Sandra decided to test the boundaries I had drawn, she was smart enough not to do it within the walls of our home. Instead, she chose a large family gathering, one of those sprawling extended dinners where distant relatives showed up to eat and pretend that we were all much closer than we actually were. It was the kind of event with an overwhelming amount of food, far too much cheap wine, and just enough time for old, buried resentments to bubble up to the surface. I was sitting at the long dining room table, surrounded by the chatter of cousins and second uncles, when Sandra laughed lightly and turned to my aunt. "Well, with military income and the stability of the government pay scale, we consider ourselves very lucky as a family," she said loudly enough for the whole table to hear. "Not many families in Raleigh have that kind of financial stability to rely on these days, so we're very blessed." My fork paused halfway to my mouth, and I felt a flash of white-hot heat behind my eyes. I didn't even look at Sandra. Instead, I fixed my gaze on my father, David, waiting to see if he would finally be the man I remembered him being. He just gave a small, nervous chuckle and nodded his head toward the relatives. "She's doing quite well for herself," he said, effectively validating Sandra's inclusive language. That was the singular moment I felt the final crack in our relationship. Later that same night, after the guests had departed and the house was quiet, I pulled him aside into the hallway. We stood outside the door to my old bedroom, the door closed to keep out the prying eyes of the house. "I set a very specific boundary with you, Dad," I said quietly, my voice vibrating with a cold intensity. And tonight, she walked right over it in front of the entire family. He rubbed his forehead with a hand that looked older than it had a year ago and sighed deeply. "She was just talking, and she was being complimentary of your success," he replied defensively. "You're reading entirely too much into a simple comment made at a dinner party." I looked him dead in the eye and told him, "I am reading exactly what is there, and I am not going to let you gaslight me into believing otherwise." I told him that I was asking him one last time to handle his wife and make sure she stayed out of my business. He just let out another long, weary sigh and shook his head. "You just don't understand how complicated things are here between us," he whispered. That one sentence told me everything I needed to know about the state of their marriage and his own lack of backbone. Complicated was just the word he used when the excuses for his cowardice had already been made in his mind. A few days later, while I was back at my unit, another security alert notification pinged on my phone from the bank's automated system. This one wasn't an attempt to log in. It was a formal request for information regarding beneficiary procedures and the legal requirements for adding an authorized user to an existing account. Someone had been making phone calls, trying to find into my savings. I didn't call the house to confront them this time. Instead, I started a detailed log, documenting absolutely everything that had happened. I recorded dates, times, specific bank statements, offhand comments Sandra had made, and even screenshots of her emails. I had learned long ago that in a conflict, emotions and memories could fade or be twisted over time, but hard records were permanent. Sandra grew significantly bolder after that, likely mistaking my continued silence for a form of surrender. She started framing her comments about my money as if they were just light-hearted jokes to be shared among friends. "We have to be very careful around," she would say with a high-pitched laugh during a bridge game, or she might decide to cut us off from our retirement fund. People laughed along with her, but I just sat there, my face a mask of cold indifference. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and saw her handing my father a small stack of papers over the marble counter. "These are just some basic estimates I put together, David," she said with a sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I thought we could look over these investment options together after leaves." I recognized the logo on the top of the page immediately. It was the logo of my specific military credit union. That was the night I finally stopped trying to sleep. I lay in my bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the Raleigh house as it breathed around me, the pipes knocking in the walls and the air conditioner clicking on and off in the humid night. I stared at the ceiling for hours and felt something definitive settle into its final place inside of me. It wasn't the hot, messy anger I had felt before. It was a cold, crystalline clarity that illuminated the path forward. The next morning, I was out the door for a run before the sun even began to peek over the horizon. The cold North Carolina air burned my lungs, but the physical sensation was grounding and reminded me that I was alive and capable. With every rhythmic step I took on the pavement, I replayed every single thing I had seen and every red flag I had ignored because it was easier than facing the truth. I realized that Sandra didn't want my help, and she didn't care about my well-being. She wanted total control of the narrative and the resources. And the most painful part was realizing that my father was actively letting her take it from me. When I finally returned to the house, sweaty and out of breath, Sandra was already perfectly dressed and sipping a cup of coffee at the kitchen counter. She smiled at me like nothing was wrong in the world. "Good morning," she chirped. "Did you sleep well?" "I slept fine," I replied shortly, heading toward the stairs. She tilted her head to the side, looking at me with a fake concern. "You've been awfully quiet lately, honey. Is everything okay?" I looked at her and said, "I've been busy listening, Sandra." Her permanent smile flickered just for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her armor. Later that afternoon, I made my first tactical phone call, and it wasn't to my father or to his wife. I called the Army's Legal Assistance Office on base. I didn't start by giving them names or making accusations. I simply laid out the facts of the situation, the hypotheticals, and the various scenarios I was facing. The legal officer on the other end of the line was a seasoned captain who listened with a patient, professional silence. When I was finally finished, he asked a single question that made my stomach drop into my shoes. "Did you at any point authorize any of these inquiries or share your personal information for this purpose?" "No," I told him firmly, "I did not." "Then you are absolutely right to be concerned about the security of your assets," he said. Hearing that word concerned made me feel validated. I wasn't being dramatic, I wasn't being paranoid, and I wasn't being an ungrateful daughter. I was a person being targeted by a predator. By the time I hung up that phone, the shape of the mission was becoming clear in my mind. I wasn't going to spend another minute arguing with Sandra, and I wasn't going to spend any more energy pleading with my father to do the right thing. I was going to stop waiting for another boundary to be crossed and start preparing for the inevitable engagement. That evening, Sandra tried one last time to pull me back into her web, her voice soft and calculated as she caught me in the hallway. "You know," she said, placing a warm hand on my forearm, "everything that your father and I do is for the ultimate benefit of this family." I met her eyes and didn't pull away, but I made sure my gaze was as hard as flint. "My money is not part of that everything, Sandra," I told her. Her hand dropped from my arm as if she had been burned. She didn't say another word, but I could feel the shift in the air as I walked away. She had finally realized that I wasn't just pushing back against her. I was no longer a person who was available to be managed by her. And that loss of leverage scared her more than anything I could have ever shouted at her. I didn't uncover the full scope of the truth all at once. Instead, it arrived in small, dangerous fragments that only became terrifying once I started putting the puzzle together. The first piece was a piece of mail that was clearly not meant for my eyes. It arrived while I was back at Fort Jackson, forwarded to me from my father's address in Raleigh. The envelope had been opened, and then resealed with a sloppy line of tape, then dropped into the outgoing mail pile almost like an afterthought. Inside was a formal notice from a major credit card company, thanking my father, David, for his recent inquiry regarding balance transfers and the addition of authorized users to a high-limit account. The name on the account in question was not his. It was my name, printed in bold, clinical letters. I sat on the edge of my narrow barracks bunk, the paper shaking in my hands, and felt that cold, unmistakable sensation of dread crawl up my spine. It wasn't fear of them. It was the chilling recognition that the people who were supposed to love me were actively working against me. It was the same feeling you get when a suspicion you've been harboring finally steps out of the shadows and looks you right in the eye. I called the customer service number on that letter immediately, my voice tight but controlled. The representative on the other end was professional and careful, but she eventually confirmed what I already suspected. Someone using my personal identification information had requested various account access options. They hadn't been successful yet, but the attempt had been deliberate and persistent. "Is there any logical reason why someone would think they had the legal authority to do this?" she asked me. I thought of Sandra's hand on my arm and the way she used the word family like a skeleton key to unlock doors she hadn't earned. "No," I told her, "there is no reason at all." I spent that entire afternoon locking down every single aspect of my digital life. I changed every password, updated my security questions to things they couldn't possibly guess, and added verbal passcodes to my accounts. I flagged my credit reports for heightened monitoring and placed a freeze on my identity. The woman on the fraud line walked me through the process, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "You did the right thing by calling us early," she said before we ended the call. That word, early, haunted me because it implied that something far worse was destined to happen if I hadn't acted when I did. The next piece of the puzzle fell into my lap during my very next visit home to Raleigh. I was searching through the house for an old notebook Sarah used to keep, nothing important, just something to help the house feel like it still belonged to my mother. I checked the hall closet, then the junk drawer, and finally, I opened a small, forgotten cabinet in my father's study. That was where I found the folder. It wasn't hidden behind a false wall or locked in a safe. It was just sitting on the middle shelf, tucked between some old household manuals and tax returns. It was a simple blue folder labeled in Sandra's neat, cursive handwriting with the word planning. Inside was a collection of printed emails, rough budget drafts, various loan projections, and a detailed list of assets, specifically my assets. My name appeared on almost every page, typed at the top of documents I had never authorized and had never seen before in my life. There were notes scrawled in the margins about temporary transfers, family bridge loans, and eventual account consolidation. My throat went completely dry as I stood there in the quiet study. I could hear the sounds of Sandra moving around in the kitchen just down the hall, the clinking of plates, the running of water, the ordinary sounds of a home that no longer felt safe. One specific page stopped me cold. It was a small, handwritten note on a yellow sticky pad, tucked behind a spreadsheet of my expected annual earnings. "She won't say no forever," the note read. "Once she truly understands the nature of family responsibility, she will see that it's much better this way for everyone." There was no signature on the note, but there didn't need to be. I knew those loops and swirls anywhere. I closed the folder carefully, ensuring it was exactly where I had found it, and walked out of the study without making a single sound. My hands were perfectly steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. At dinner that night, Sandra was her usual self, talking about the rising cost of groceries and how unpredictable the economy had become. She spoke with the practiced cadence of someone who was laying the groundwork for a future request, not someone who was asking for a favor. I sat there and watched them both, my father and my stepmother, and I thought about all the years I had defended his quiet nature. I thought about how many times I had told myself he was just grieving my mother, or that he was just tired, or that he was just a kind man trying to keep the peace. But in that moment, I realized that peace was an expensive commodity, and I was the only one being asked to foot the bill for it. Later that same evening, my father knocked softly on my bedroom door. He stood there awkwardly in the doorway, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets and his eyes looking ancient and tired. "Your stepmother mentioned that you seemed a little distant at dinner," he said, searching for an opening. I didn't invite him into the room. "I found the folder in your study, Dad," I said, my voice flat. I saw him stiffen immediately, his shoulders hunching as if he were expecting a blow. "You went through our private things?" he asked, his voice trembling. I recognized my own name on the cover of a folder sitting in plain sight, I replied. "I saw detailed plans for my money that I never agreed to." He let out a long, heavy exhale and looked at the ceiling. She was just thinking ahead for the future. She was just trying to be prepared. "For whom?" I asked. "For whose future?" "She worries about the house, and she worries about our security," he said. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice rising just a fraction. "What about my security?" He just looked away, unable to answer, and that was all the confirmation I needed. After he left the room, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the realization wash over me. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't even grief. It was just the dull, heavy ache of total clarity. I finally understood that my father wasn't just a victim of Sandra's manipulation. He was an active, willing participant in the scheme. The next morning, I was on the phone with the bank's fraud department again. This time, I didn't speak in hypotheticals or worries. I gave them dates, times, descriptions of the documents I had seen, and the exact wording of the handwritten note. I gave them the address and the names involved. The tone of the person on the other end of the line changed instantly, becoming sharp and official. "Do not confront them about this yet," the agent advised me. "Continue to document everything you find, and we will open a formal investigation file." Hearing the word file made the situation feel so official, so heavy. By the time my leave was over and I returned to Fort Jackson, I had developed a systematic way of handling the betrayal. I scanned every single relevant document I could find. I took photographs of every handwritten note and sticky pad. I saved every single email and logged every conversation, noting the date, the time, and the exact phrasing used. I kept digital copies in 2 separate, secure cloud locations that they had no way of accessing. I spent my free time studying the laws regarding financial exploitation and account security in the state of North Carolina. The military had taught me the value of planning for every possible contingency, and I was applying that training to my own family. Sandra noticed the change in me before my father did. During one of our weekly phone calls, her voice sounded light and airy, but there was an edge to it. "You've been awfully busy lately," she remarked. "You barely tell us anything about what's going on in your life anymore." "I'm just focused on my work right now," I told her, giving her nothing. "That's good, dear," she said, "but remember that we all have to do our part to support the family." I almost laughed out loud at the irony. Instead, I just ended the call and added her words to my log of evidence. The final, definitive piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly in my email inbox, a message from a loan officer at a local bank in Raleigh. It was clearly a mistake, an email meant for my father that had been accidentally sent to me because of our similar names or a shared contact entry. It was a simple apology for a delay in processing, followed by an attachment of a draft loan application. I opened the file and saw that my father and Sandra were applying for a significant home equity loan, and listed under collateral and expected income was my military salary and my future retirement projections. That was the moment I knew for sure. This wasn't just a case of overreaching or a misunderstanding of boundaries. This was a calculated, long-term strategy to use my life as a financial backstop for their own desires, and I knew that strategies could be dismantled if you had the right intel. I didn't sleep much that night, lying in the dark barracks and listening to the rhythmic breathing of the other soldiers around me. I thought about my mother, Sarah, and how meticulous she had been with everything in her life. I remembered how she used to label every box in the attic, and how she used to tell me that being prepared was the highest form of love you could show yourself. I finally understood the weight of her words. By the time the morning bugle sounded, my grief had sharpened into a lethal resolve. They thought my silence was a form of permission, and they thought my distance was a sign of ignorance. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I didn't change my behavior immediately, because that would have been a tactical error. People who are trying to exert control tend to panic when they sense resistance, and panic makes them sloppy. But they only get sloppy if you let them feel safe first. So I stayed perfectly polite. I continued to answer Sandra's calls and responded to my father's occasional texts. I smiled during our video chats and talked about the weather or my training without ever sharing a single meaningful detail. I asked about the house and their health, making myself sound like the dutiful daughter they expected, while revealing absolutely nothing of my own plans. Inside my mind, I was building a case with surgical precision. Every morning, I would review my notes and the evidence I had gathered. I treated the situation like a military intelligence operation: verify, corroborate, and document. Emotions were a luxury I couldn't afford. Only structure and facts would win this fight. I opened a completely new bank account at a national institution that my family had no connection to, and I redirected my entire paycheck into it. I placed a high-level security alert on every single one of my old accounts and froze my credit with all 3 major bureaus. When the confirmation emails arrived, I archived them in a folder I simply labeled evidence. I consulted with the legal office again, this time bringing the specific documents and screenshots I had gathered. The captain didn't interrupt me as I spoke. He just leaned back in his chair and listened. When I was finally finished, he looked at me and said, "This is not just a family tension. This is a clear-cut case of attempted financial exploitation and fraud." Hearing a legal professional say those words out loud stripped away the very last layer of doubt I had. This was not about family, it was about misconduct. "What are my legal options here?" I asked him. He outlined the path forward: civil remedies, protective orders, and even criminal escalation if I chose to go that route. He emphasized that I was the one in control now. "You get to decide exactly how far this goes," he told me. That night, I called the bank's fraud unit again, this time speaking with the specific agent assigned to my case. I asked about procedures, timelines, and what kind of documentation would carry the most weight in a courtroom. While I was on that call, a message from Sandra popped up on my phone screen. "Just checking in, honey. Your father has been so stressed lately, and we're all just so worried about you." I saved the message to the log and kept talking to the bank. The next step was the hardest part of the plan. I had to let them think their scheme was actually working. During our next call, I casually mentioned that I was feeling overwhelmed by managing all my finances on my own while being so busy with duty. I let a hint of artificial uncertainty creep into my voice for the first time. Sandra pounced on the opening like a predator. "Oh, you don't have to carry that burden all by yourself," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Families are supposed to share these kinds of burdens." I told her that I just didn't know where to even start with organizing everything. Her voice warmed instantly, becoming sugary sweet. "Well, your father can help you with all of that, dear. We both can." That was the moment I knew for a fact that she believed she had finally won. Over the following few weeks, she began to push the envelope carefully, making a suggestion here and a comment there about how much easier my life would be if all our finances were centralized. She framed every move as an act of support, but I was recording every single attempt for my file. My father continued to avoid my eyes whenever the subject came up, his silence becoming a record of its own. I began rehearsing the conversation I knew was coming, practicing my delivery until it was cold and strategic. I chose the setting for the final confrontation with extreme care, a planned family dinner in Raleigh on neutral ground, with enough witnesses to matter but not enough to turn it into a public spectacle. I didn't want a scene. I wanted total clarity. When the evening finally arrived, Sandra was radiant, looking every bit the woman who felt she was in total control of her world. She talked at length about the future, about the stability of the family, and about how incredibly proud she was of our girl. Halfway through the dessert course, she finally decided it was time to move. "We've been doing some thinking, David and I," she said, glancing over at my father for support. "Maybe it's finally time to formalize some of these financial safeguards we've been discussing." I slowly set my spoon down on the table and looked her in the eyes. "What specific safeguards are you talking about, Sandra?" I asked. She smiled, seemingly unbothered. "Oh, just some basic things to protect all of us in case anything ever happens." I leaned forward slightly. "To whom? In case anything happens to whom exactly?" She hesitated for a split second, her eyes flickering. "To any of us, of course," she replied. I nodded my head slowly and said, "Well, I've already taken care of safeguarding my own accounts." Her smile faltered, a look of confusion crossing her face. "I've been in contact with my bank's fraud department and the Army's legal assistance office," I stated, my voice as level as a horizon. The table went instantly quiet. My father's face went pale, and Sandra's eyes sharpened into two cold points of light. "Why on earth would you feel the need to do something like that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Because someone recently tried to access my personal finances without my authorization," I said, refusing to blink. She let out a soft, nervous laugh. "That sounds a little dramatic, don't you think?" I told her that the attempts were documented and that I wasn't guessing. "I warned you both," I said, turning my gaze to my father. "I set a very clear boundary and it was crossed." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "We were just trying to help make things easier for you," he whispered. "No, you were trying to make decisions for me without my consent," I corrected him. "There is a massive difference between those two things." Sandra leaned back in her chair, her mask of maternal concern finally cracking. "I think you are significantly overreacting to all of this," she snapped. "No," I said, "I am simply being prepared." I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't make a single accusation or threat. I just let them sit in the realization that the version of me they thought they could manage was gone forever. After dinner, as I was preparing to leave, Sandra tried to corner me in the kitchen. "You are making this into something incredibly ugly," she hissed at me. "It was already ugly, Sandra," I replied. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't." She stared at me, her mind clearly racing to find a new angle. "You think you have all the power here, don't you?" she asked. "I know I do," I told her, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes. She realized then what my father hadn't, that I wasn't bluffing and I wasn't acting out of emotion. I was being methodical, and methodical people do not stop until the mission is complete. The entire dinner had been Sandra's idea, framed as a gesture of reconciliation, which should have been my first warning sign. I knew that people who have wronged you rarely seek peace unless they are trying to regain the ground they've lost. She had suggested inviting our extended family, aunt, a cousin I rarely spoke to, and a few family friends who still treated me like a child. "It will be a wonderful chance to reconnect," Sandra had told me on the phone. "We've all been under so much stress lately." I agreed to attend immediately, which I could tell had surprised her. I could practically hear her recalibrating her plan on the other end of the line. The evening was crisp and cool, the perfect autumn night in North Carolina. Sandra had set the table with her finest china and spaced the candles with a precision that felt like she was preparing a stage for a performance. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored sweater that made her look approachable and kind. My father was hovering nervously near the kitchen sink, drying the same dinner glass over and over again. When the guests arrived, the house was filled with the sounds of laughter and the smells of cinnamon and roasted vegetables. Everyone was complimentary, and several people mentioned how proud they were of my service. Sandra took every single opening she was given. "She's doing so well," she would say brightly, "and we are just so grateful as a family for that kind of security." There it was again, the recurring theme. I caught my father's eye, but he quickly looked away. The dinner itself was a long, slow affair of stories and shared laughter. Sandra steered the conversation with the skill of a seasoned pilot, always circling back to the themes of responsibility and planning for the future. I just waited for my moment. It finally arrived during the dessert course. "So," my aunt said, "do you plan on staying in the army for the long haul?" I told her that I liked what I did and that it was a possibility. Sandra immediately chimed in, "And with the kind of income she has, she's going to have so many options for the future." I set my fork down with a deliberate motion and asked, "What specific options are you talking about, Sandra?" She blinked at me, her smile faltering for a second. "Well, things like investing for the family and making sure everyone is taken care of as we get older." The table went quiet as people waited for my response. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim, white envelope, placing it directly on the table between us. Sandra's eyes were glued to it instantly. "What is that, dear?" she asked. "It's a summary," I said, "of the recent unauthorized activity connected to my bank accounts." I saw my father stiffen in his chair. Sandra gave a light, airy laugh. "Is this really the appropriate time for this?" I told her that I thought it was the perfect time, since she had already brought up the topic of my money in front of everyone else. I didn't open the envelope or show them the contents. I just let it sit there like a ticking bomb. I told the table that I had been contacted by the bank regarding multiple attempts to access my accounts and unauthorized inquiries into my assets. The room went deathly still. Aunt looked between us, her expression one of utter confusion. "That sounds like some kind of clerical mistake," Sandra said quickly, her voice rising. "Banks make mistakes like that all the time." "Not these kinds of mistakes," I said, "and not repeatedly." My father finally spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. "Can we please just talk about this later?" I told him that I was comfortable talking about it now, since the family's security seemed to be such a public topic. I saw Sandra's jaw tighten as she realized she had lost control of the room. I told them that I had opened a formal file with the fraud department and had consulted with legal experts. The shift in the air was palpable. Sandra's hand was trembling as she reached for her water glass, her smile now looking like it was carved out of stone. "This is so unnecessary," she whispered. "We are family." I told her that was exactly why it mattered so much. No one else spoke, and the only sound was the flickering of the candles. I turned to my father and reminded him that I had warned him about the boundaries. "I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything tonight," I said to the room. "I'm just here to inform you of the facts. There will be a formal meeting soon with legal professionals to discuss the next steps." Sandra leaned back in her chair, her composure finally shattered. "You are threatening us," she hissed. "No," I replied. "I am giving you clarity." The rest of that dinner passed in a surreal haze of forced conversation and awkward silences. No one would look me in the eye. When the guests finally began to leave, Sandra hugged them all with a desperate intensity, her smile fixed firmly in place. To any outside observer, it would have looked like a normal, successful evening. But once the last guest had driven away, she turned on me with a ferocity I hadn't seen before. "You humiliated me in front of our family," she screamed. "I simply told the truth," I replied. "You did this on purpose to hurt us," she accused. "Yes," I said, "I did." My father stood between us, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Can we please just all calm down and talk like adults?" he asked. I told him that I was perfectly calm and that was the point. Sandra laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You think you've actually won something tonight?" "I think you finally understand the situation," I said, "and that is enough for tonight." She stared at the white envelope still sitting on the dining table. "What is actually in there?" she asked. I told her she would see it at the meeting. She started to argue, then stopped herself as she looked at my face. For the first time, she looked completely uncertain of her next move. That night, I slept better than I had in a very long time, because I knew that the power of leverage is gone once it is brought into the light. The legal meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a particularly humid Tuesday morning in downtown Raleigh. I had insisted that we not meet at the house on the cul-de-sac, nor at some overly casual local, where the clinking of porcelain and the chatter of strangers would provide a distracting soundtrack to our serious business. I wanted neutral ground, so I chose a professional office suite with floor-to-ceiling glass walls and minimalist, neutral art that looked like it had been chosen by a committee specifically to avoid evoking any kind of strong emotion. It was the kind of place designed to keep feelings from staining the expensive leather furniture, a sterile environment where facts could be laid bare without the interference of nostalgia or sentimental manipulation. I had chosen this setting with the deliberate precision of a commanding officer selecting a battlefield. I knew that in their world, emotions were used as a smoke screen to blur the sharp edges of the truth. But in this office, the legal papers would sharpen those edges until they were impossible to ignore. My father, David, arrived first, looking significantly older and more frazzled than he had even a week earlier during our dinner confrontation. His shoulders were hunched forward, as if he were trying to protect his chest from a physical blow, and his silk tie was knotted so tightly that it looked painful, as if he had pulled it that way to physically remind himself that he was still a man in control of his own circumstances. He offered me a stiff, uncertain nod when I entered the room, a gesture that felt more like a stranger acknowledging another stranger on a bus than a father greeting his only child. Sandra arrived exactly 3 minutes late, a classic power move she had used for years to ensure all eyes were on her when she made an entrance. She was dressed in a sharp dark blazer and high heels that clicked with a rhythmic, aggressive sharpness against the polished tile floor, each step announcing her presence like she still believed this was a stage where she could command the narrative. She offered a practiced, sugary smile to the receptionist and made a show of admiring the framed law certificates on the wall, acknowledging everyone in the room except for me. We finally sat down around a large glass table that felt as cold as the atmosphere in the room. The mediator, a professional woman with a calm and detached demeanor, introduced herself first, followed by the attorney I had retained through the recommendation of the JAG office. My attorney was a quiet, precise woman who spoke only when it was absolutely necessary to move the process forward. I noticed Sandra watching's hands instead of her face, a subtle sign of nervousness that told me she was finally beginning to realize that her charm would have no currency in this environment. "Let's begin," the mediator said, her voice cutting through the tension. I didn't speak first, choosing instead to let the silence do the initial work of unsettling them. Sandra, true to form, couldn't handle the lack of conversation for more than a few seconds. "This all seems incredibly dramatic and unnecessary, don't you think?" she said with a light, airy laugh. "We're only here because of a minor misunderstanding between family members." Didn't even look up from her notes as she slid a thick blue folder across the glass table toward them. "The documentation suggests something far more deliberate than a misunderstanding," she stated flatly. I watched as Sandra's artificial smile tightened until it looked like a surgical scar. The mediator cleared her throat and suggested we start with a review of the facts. So we did, going through the timeline of the betrayal piece by piece. We presented the dates of the attempted bank accesses, the detailed logs of the unauthorized inquiries into my social security number, and the various draft loan applications I had discovered. Then pulled out a high-resolution copy of the handwritten note I had found in the study, the one where Sandra had written that I wouldn't say no forever once I understood my responsibility. Finally, we placed the most damning piece of evidence on the table, the collateral listing for the home equity loan that explicitly listed my military income and expected future earnings as part of their household assets. Each item was presented with a calm, methodical regularity, no accusations, no raised voices, and no emotional appeals. Just a steady stream of undeniable facts. My father stared straight ahead at a point on the wall, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack, while Sandra shifted restlessly in her chair, crossing and uncrossing her legs as she searched for a rebuttal. "This doesn't actually prove any kind of criminal intent," she said, her voice losing some of its melodic quality. "Families make plans for the future all the time. It's what people do." Looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses. "People typically do not plan for the future using other people's money without their knowledge or consent," she replied. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The mediator turned her attention to me and asked, "What specific outcome are you seeking from this meeting?" I took a slow, deep breath, making sure I maintained the steadiness I had rehearsed for days in my barracks room. "First," I said, my voice carrying a weight that made Sandra flinch, "I require a formal written acknowledgement that my finances are mine and mine alone. There will be no shared access, no inquiries into my accounts, and no future planning involving my name without my explicit, written consent." Sandra opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the space. "Second," I continued, "I want a signed statement from both of you confirming that every prior attempt to access or leverage my accounts was completely unauthorized." I saw my father flinch at the word unauthorized, the legal weight of it finally sinking in. "Third," I said, "I demand a legally binding commitment that my name, my military income, and my future earnings will never again be used in any financial discussions, applications, or representations for any reason whatsoever." Sandra leaned forward over the table, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory anger. "And what exactly happens if we choose not to agree to these ridiculous terms?" she asked. I met her gaze with a level of intensity that made her blink. "Then the formal fraud file I have opened with the bank, and the army moves forward to the next stage of legal and criminal escalation," I told her. The room went completely quiet, the kind of silence that feels like the moment before an explosion. My father finally spoke, his voice sounding like it was being pulled from a deep well of shame. "You would actually do that to us. You would bring criminal charges against your own father." I looked him right in the face and said, "I already had to take these steps just to protect myself from the people who were supposed to be protecting me." He rubbed his face with both hands, looking defeated. "We were just trying to make things easier for everyone in the long run," he whispered, still clinging to the lie. "For whom?" I asked him. "Who was this supposed to make things easier for?" He didn't answer, and the mediator interjected gently, suggesting that there were alternatives to a full legal escalation, such as a formal settlement and the establishment of clear, enforceable boundaries. "That is exactly what I am offering you today," I said, "a way for this to end here provided you sign the documents." Sandra let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "You're actually enjoying this, aren't you? You're enjoying having this power over us." "No," I replied, "I'm not enjoying any of this. I'm just ending it so I can finally have some peace." She turned to my father, her eyes pleading and manipulative. "David, are you really going to let her do this to me? Are you going to let her humiliate us like this?" He hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, and that brief space of uncertainty, the space where he should have stood up for me years ago, was the final confirmation I needed. I knew then that our relationship would never truly recover. "Place the final document on the glass table. This outlines the specific terms of the agreement," she said. "If this is signed today, no further legal action will be taken regarding the prior attempts at fraud." Sandra scanned the page with a frantic energy, her face changing color as she processed the restrictive language. "This severely limits our ability to manage the house," she snapped. "It protects me from being used as collateral for a house I don't own," I replied. "And what about our family?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Family doesn't require a backdoor key to my bank accounts, Sandra," I told her. She looked at my father again, her voice sharp. "Say something, David, tell her she's being ridiculous." He swallowed hard and looked at the document on the table. "Sandra, I think we should probably just sign it," he said, his voice barely audible. Her head snapped toward him in disbelief. After everything I've done for you, after the way I've handled this household so you wouldn't have to, the mediator raised a hand to keep the conversation productive. Sandra leaned back in her chair, her composure finally dissolving into a cold, hard resentment. "You're choosing her over me," she whispered to him. My father didn't look at her, he just kept his eyes on the table. "I'm choosing to stop this situation from getting any worse than it already is," he said. I watched them both with a sense of detached observation, as if I were looking at a complex machinery that I finally understood from the outside. I wasn't asking them to choose sides. I was simply drawing a line in the dirt and telling them not to cross it. The mediator slid a heavy silver pen across the table. Sandra didn't reach for it, but my father did, his hand shaking as he gripped the pen. "Wait," Sandra said, her voice sounding desperate. "If we sign this, what exactly happens next? What becomes of the fraud file?" Explained that the matter would be considered resolved between the parties, provided there were no further violations of the terms. Sandra's fingers curled into her palms until her nails left marks in her skin. "And if we don't sign it?" she asked. "Then the documentation is forwarded to the appropriate authorities this afternoon," I told her, my voice devoid of any hesitation. She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time without the mask of her calculations. "You think you're so incredibly disciplined, don't you?" she said quietly. "You think you're so controlled and superior because of that uniform." I looked back at her and said, "I am controlled, and that is exactly why this process is working." She turned her head away, her jaw tight with a suppressed rage. My father signed the document first, the sound of the pen scratching against the heavy paper feeling louder than it should have in the quiet room. Sandra stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity before she snatched the pen from his hand and signed her name with a sharp, angry stroke. The mediator collected the documents and nodded to us all. "Thank you," she said. "We will have these finalized and copies sent to everyone by the end of the day." As we all stood up to leave, my father lingered behind, looking like he wanted to say something more. "Can we please just talk for a minute alone?" he asked me softly. I shook my head and told him, "Not today, Dad, I need some time." Sandra walked past us both without a single word, her heels echoing down the long hallway as she made her exit, each step heavy with the weight of her defeat. Once I got outside, the North Carolina air felt cool and clear against my skin. I took a deep, lung-filling breath and felt a massive tension loosen in my chest. It wasn't exactly the feeling of relief I had expected, but it was a feeling of completion. I hadn't won a war because there are no winners in a family conflict like this, but I had successfully concluded a chapter that had been draining the life out of me. 2 days later, I was back in my car, making the long drive from Raleigh back to Fort Jackson. The drive was long, stretching across flat highways and through the early morning fog that clung to the pine trees. I kept the radio off for the entire trip, wanting to hear the sound of my own thoughts and to test how they sounded now that I wasn't constantly in a state of defensive posture. My thoughts felt quieter and more focused than they had in years. My father sent me a single text message later that week, just a few short words. "I truly hope you're okay." I didn't respond to him, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I no longer had the energy to fill in the gaps for him. Hope without any kind of real accountability was just another form of avoidance in my eyes, and I was officially done doing the emotional work for both of us. Sandra didn't reach out at all, which didn't surprise me. I learned a few weeks later through a distant relative that she was busy crafting a new narrative for our community. She was telling anyone who would listen that I had become cold and unfeeling, that the military had changed my personality for the worse, and that I had turned the subject of money into something ugly and divisive. I didn't feel the need to correct her or defend myself. People like Sandra always need a narrative where they are the misunderstood victim of forces beyond their control, and I was perfectly fine letting her have that story. Anyone in my life who actually mattered had already seen enough of her true nature to know better. What surprised me the most as the weeks went by was how little I actually missed the house in Raleigh. I had expected to feel a sense of grief or nostalgia for the place where I had grown up. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the home I missed hadn't really existed since my mother died. Everything that had happened in that house after her death had been a version of reality edited and managed by someone else's hand. On my first free weekend back at the base, I decided to drive to the small, quiet cemetery where my mother was buried. It was a beautiful afternoon, the grass trimmed neatly, and the headstones catching the soft light of the declining sun. I didn't bring any flowers or any prepared speech. I just stood there in front of her grave and told her the simple truth. "I handled it, Mom," I said softly, the wind carrying my words through the trees. "I didn't let them take what wasn't theirs to take." I thought back to the 15-year-old girl I had been when she died, and how desperately I had tried to keep our family together at my own expense. I thought about how willing I had been to shrink myself and disappear into the background, just to make sure everyone else was comfortable. I wished I could go back and tell that younger version of myself that her silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was just love that had been misdirected toward the wrong people. "I finally learned how to say no," I whispered to the headstone, "and I learned how to mean it." For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone else's permission to breathe or to exist. Life slowly settled into a new, healthier rhythm after that. My bank accounts stayed exactly where they belonged, under my total control, and my name was removed from every single document that wasn't my personal responsibility. The fraud file at the bank was eventually marked as resolved and closed. I took the blue folder labeled Evidence and placed it in a secure storage locker, not as a threat, but as a permanent reminder of the lessons I had learned. My father tried to reach me one more time a few months later, leaving a long, rambling voicemail late on a Friday night. He sounded tired and older, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I should have protected you from her," he said. "I know I failed you, and I am so deeply sorry for that." I listened to the message twice, taking in the weight of his apology, and then I archived it. I knew that apologies couldn't rebuild trust that had been systematically dismantled over years, but they did provide a necessary acknowledgement of the damage that had been done. I wasn't cruel enough to deny him the chance to reflect on his actions, but I also knew that I wasn't obligated to resume a relationship with him just because he finally understood the cost of his long silence. Some lessons in life simply arrive too late to fix what has been broken, and that wasn't my responsibility to repair. The military had given me the structure I needed to survive, and my mother had given me the core values that defined my character. But this experience, as unwanted and exhausting as it had been, gave me something entirely different: boundaries. I learned that boundaries aren't meant to be walls to keep people out or punishments for those who have wronged you. They are simply clear lines drawn with intention to show where you end and where someone else begins. I didn't walk away from the situation with a sense of satisfaction or a desire for a victory lap. There was no dramatic sense of triumph to be found in the wreckage of a family. What I gained was something much quieter and more sustainable. I gained total ownership of my own life. I gained the profound understanding that respect does not require someone else's permission to exist, and that being called difficult is often just another way of describing a person who is no longer willing to be used for someone else's convenience. Most importantly, I learned that the concept of family isn't defined by having access to someone's bank account or their personal information. It is defined by genuine care and mutual respect. And real, authentic care never needs to be extracted through manipulation or legal threats. It is given freely, or it isn't care at all. As I stood on the parade ground at Fort Jackson a few weeks later, watching the sun set over the training fields, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a young girl. I was a soldier, a daughter, and most importantly, an independent woman who had finally learned to value herself. I was ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that my foundation was finally solid and my life was finally mine. The Raleigh house eventually sold, and my father and Sandra moved into a smaller townhome on the other side of the city. I heard through the grapevine that their marriage was struggling under the weight of their financial reality, but I didn't go looking for more information. Their lives were their own to manage, just as mine was mine. I continued to excel in my Army career, finding a sense of purpose and community that didn't require me to compromise my integrity. I often think about the girl I was when I first left for basic training, the one who was so eager to please and so afraid of making waves. I realized that she had to go through that fire to become the woman I am today. The scars from the betrayal are still there, of course, but they don't hurt anymore. They are just part of the map of my life, reminding me of where I've been and what I've overcome. If this story has resonated with you in any way, if you have ever had to draw a difficult line where one didn't exist before, or if you have struggled to protect yourself from the very people you were supposed to trust, I would truly love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from or what specific part of this story stayed with you the most. We share stories like this every single day, stories about personal boundaries, resilience in the face of betrayal, and the journey of finding your footing again after the ground has been pulled from beneath you. If you don't want to miss the next story in our series, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we explore the complexities of human relationships and the power of the human spirit. Let's keep walking this path of growth and understanding together, one story at a time. I look forward to reading your perspectives and hearing about your own journeys toward autonomy and self-respect. Until next time, stay strong, stay focused, and remember that you are the only one who truly holds the keys to your own life. The world can be a difficult place to navigate, especially when the people closest to us fail to recognize our worth or try to use us for their own gain. But as long as we hold onto our truth and refuse to flinch when the pressure mounts, we can find our way to the other side. My mother always said that the truth has a way of coming to the surface eventually, and she was right. It just took a little bit of military discipline and a lot of courage to help it get there. I still have the walnut filing cabinet in my apartment now, a new one that I bought myself. It's filled with my own papers, my own achievements, and my own plans for a future that I am building on my own terms. There's a special place in the top drawer for the documents we signed that day in Raleigh, a reminder that I am my own person and that my life belongs to me. And whenever I look at that folder, I don't feel sad anymore. I just feel cert. The road ahead of me is wide open, and for the first time in a very long time, I am excited to see where it leads. Whether I stay in the military for 20 years or decide to take my skills into the civilian world, I know that I will do it with the same integrity and strength that my mother instilled in me. I am no longer defined by the expectations of others or the guilt of a family that didn't know how to love me correctly. I am finally free. As the months turned into a year, the frequency of the calls from Raleigh dwindled until they became almost non-existent. The silence was no longer a burden, it was a sanctuary. I had created a life that was insulated from the drama and the manipulation, and I was thriving in it. My friends and colleagues at the base became my chosen family, providing the support and the respect that I had always craved. I learned that true stability doesn't come from a bank account or a government housing allowance. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and having the courage to protect that person at all costs. My mother would be proud of the woman I've become, and that is more than enough for me. I am done looking back at the wreckage of the past. I am only looking forward at the promise of the future. The sun has finally set on that chapter of my life, and a new day is dawning. It's a day filled with possibilities, and I am the one holding the compass. I know that there will be more challenges ahead, more boundaries to draw, and more truths to face, but I also know that I am ready for them. I have been through the fire, and I have come out the other side stronger than ever before. I hope that my story can serve as a reminder to anyone else who is feeling trapped or exploited that you have the power to change your circumstances. You have the right to your own life, your own resources, and your own peace of mind. Don't be afraid to draw that line, even if it feels like the hardest thing you've ever done. The freedom on the other side is worth every single step of the journey. Thank you for being part of this journey with me and for listening to the truth of my experience. We are all connected by our stories, and by sharing them, We help each other find the strength to keep going. Stay true to yourselves, and never let anyone else hold the pen that writes your story. I'll see you in the next one, where we will continue to explore the resilience of the human heart and the power of finding your own way.